Tom is a full psychiatrist, which is wonderful to have a fellow psychiatrist lecturing. He's from the San Francisco and is a senior Jungian training analyst there. He's published a number of works, and a couple ones I would point out to. One is his work on cultural complexes that he did a few years back, which really fits hand in glove with what he's talking about today. The other work that just was released, gosh, a few weeks ago, I think in Montreal, we gave the release to it, is Psyche and the City, if I'm remembering the title right. And he's editor of a book compiling numerous Jungian analysts, each describing their own city from a analytical, symbolic perspective. A wonderful book if you get a chance. So with that, I turn it over to Tom Singer.
Good. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you to you and Laurel here in Sonoma and her technological team, because this is quite a feat to try and pull all of this together. We've got film clips from Australia and people, at least earlier, from Switzerland and like 12 or 15 countries around the world. It's pretty amazing to participate in something like this. Actually, I want to plug the book just very briefly because it's called Psyche and the City, A Soul's Guide to the Modern Metropolis. And in that sense, it's very related to what we're doing here because it's Jungians from around the world reflecting on their cities. There's only 1 or 2 restaurants mentioned in the book. There are no museums, no hotels. It's a totally unconventional guidebook to soul and city, and I'm very proud of it because I think it came out just beautifully and absolutely unique, and so I would like to recommend that to you. I've sort of divided. There are going to be 2 parts to my presentation, and I hope enough time for good questions as well, and I'm actually comfortable with being interrupted because sometimes that's a very stimulating way to talk about things. And so if you have a question or a concern or something doesn't quite suit you, don't hesitate to raise your hand because I find that's more stimulating than disrupting. In this first section, I'm going to be touching 3 broad themes. 1 is the collective psyche, the concept of that. 2, the concept of the cultural complex. And 3, the transcendent function, all of which were sort of talked about a bit this morning, but I'm going to hone in on them. And then I'm going to, in the second part, get to, this is supposed to be the case of Barack Obama, but actually I'll be talking about Obama in the first section. The second section, we're actually premiering some film clips from a new film that's going to be released in Sundance Film Festival in January of this year called My America, and it's made by a young Australian filmmaker that I've worked with over the last few years, and you'll see why it's related to what we're talking about. So we're going to have some world premiere clips from this new documentary film, and I'm going to be talking about America and Obama in the world's imagination. And I'm going to be talking about the art of playing to or unraveling the knots of cultural complexes. And you'll see that I'm focused on a very specific aspect of the psyche. It's going to be different than Murray and different from Bernard because my focus is in a different level of the psyche, and I'll make that very clear in the early part of the talk. And you'll see how we both share points of view, but how I have a different point of view, particularly when we're talking about politics and leadership and Obama. This first image, which I think, can you see it on this big screen here too?
That little screen over there?
That's on the little screen, but I'm hoping it can be on the big screen here as well.
Tom, we can see it well on the monitor. It's on our monitor. So that's good.
Yeah, and do you have it up, Steve, on your monitor?
Yes, we sure do. Yeah, and it's on the web streaming site as well, so it's definitely
up. Okay, good, because I'm going to be speaking a lot from images today. I think images, when it comes to talking about symbols in culture or archetypal symbols, you can talk and talk and talk about them, and sometimes a single image will really take you right to the heart of the symbol. And so I'm going to be using a lot of symbolic images, or a lot of images. You may or may not think they're symbolic. And I want to announce one other thing, because I'm hoping I'm going to get you all excited enough about the concept of cultural complexes we're inaugurating a new research project through ARIS, which is an organization I work with, the Archives for Research into Archetypal Symbolism. And if you go to aris.org, you will find on the cover page there's a place where you can sign up for a free journal. And in the next few months in that journal, we're going to be announcing a research project in which we're going to be encouraging people, you people right here and people who happen to be tuning in on this around the world, to submit symbolic images with a description of the cultural context in which they occur. So it's going to be a cultural complex symbolic image research project which we're going to conduct over the web. And I think it should be very stimulating and interesting to all of you. And I'm going to show you how I think about images in terms of symbolic process and in terms of political process. This first image is by Robert Rauschenberg, and I hope you can see it well enough. But Murray referred to 1968 and a party in Washington, D.C., where he was first introduced to Jung during the Vietnam War and so on. Well, actually, I was first introduced to Jung in 1967 in the basement of the Yale Medical School. There was a Jungian who arrived there, and that was a really weird bird. At that time, Jungians, I thought Jung was dead, and I didn't know there were Jungians. So, 67 and 68, Jungians were, if you saw them at all, they were in the basement, or they certainly weren't in the university. And maybe it's obviously less true today. But this was a time of enormous cultural upheaval. And in some ways, if we're going to talk about Obama and symbolic process and leadership, if you go back to the 60s, the origins of a lot of what we're talking about, certainly you can go as far back as Bernard did this morning to the Egyptians, but I'm not going to start with the Egyptians. I'm going to start with 1967. And in 1967, we had the Vietnam War, we had race riots in New Haven and other parts of the country. I happen to be in New Haven. And the country was in tatters. It really was coming apart. And so there was no image of wholeness that was a prevalent symbolic image of culture at that time. I think Rauschenberg got it as well as anybody did in this image, because you've got the man on the moon, and you've got Vietnam War, and you've got Janis Joplin singing her heart out, and you've got riots on the streets in wherever, all over the country, where there's a black man lying dead, and you've got Martin Luther King shot and John F. Kennedy shot. So that it was a time in which our culture was coming apart at the seams, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was like a hole got blown in the ego of the collective psyche of America as it had been constituted up until that time. And all sorts of energies started to break through, which in a way were the inheritors of things that broke through the collective persona of the mid to late 60s in an absolutely revolutionary way. And many of the things we think about and study today, and even the fascination and intoxication with Obama, mirrored sort of the epic of the Kennedys and of Martin Luther King, and the issues in some ways remain the same. We have a war that was unpopular, and we have a president-elect who was Catholic, which at that time had never happened before. You had race riots between blacks and whites, so you had war, you had race, you had a president coming out of a part of the population that had never been represented before in the White House. It was an incredibly stimulating time, and the purpose of all this is to begin to demonstrate the idea that there's such a thing as the collective psyche. Now, you may all take that for granted. I mean, that may just be something that you think we all know about and has always been there, but actually, if you talk to people about the collective psyche, a lot of people go dumb when you say something like that. They really don't know what you're talking about. You're talking about a very subtle thread of psychic life and psychic energy that flows through large groups of people, often imperceptible in the same way that soul can be imperceptible, but moves people very, very deeply. And it's hard to, if you're a sociologist, you can say this group of people votes this way and this group of people votes that way, but to talk about the collective psyche is a much more elusive phenomena, and I think the way one tunes into it is through art. I think our artists and our poets are the ones who put us in tune with that level of psychic reality, and that's why I chose the Rauschenberg image, because collective psyche is at the heart of what I think he's evoking in this very powerful image. Now, Jung, as Murray related today, in 1913 had a breakthrough, if you will, of the collective psyche in his fantasies that blood was going to cover the map of Europe up until the Alps. Well, that's something coming. It's not archetypal, actually. It's at the level of the collective psyche. He's picking something up that's very destructive. It has archetypal elements, but it's coming through a cultural form. Now, one of the problems, I think, with the Jungian tradition is because Jung ran into such trouble with essays about national character and about Wotan and so on, that Jung and the Jungian tradition started to focus much more on the individuation process and the individual as being the most important aspect of our work. And we kind of lost, at least in my mind, the really important thread that's very much in Jung's work about the collective psyche. And it's that piece that I picked up on in my work, and several of us in the Jungian tradition are getting more and more interested in. How do we know about the collective psyche? What is it doing? How is it moving us? How does it affect us? And the even more audacious question, is there anything we can do to move it along in one way or another? Are we simply sort of passive victims of the waves that it will, whatever course it wants to take? Now, just to show that the collective psyche is not simply an American or European phenomenon, I want to go to the next image, which is called The Dream of Reason. And this was at the San Francisco Museum, a year or so ago, and I walked into this room. It took up the whole room, a relatively small room, probably 2/3 the size of this room, but the whole room was taken up with this fantastic sort of, you could almost think of it as a sand tray, and sleeping in the back there was Chairman Mao, and it was his dream of a kind of integrated China. This was done by a Chinese artist, and when you first see it, it's magical. It was very, very powerful, and you think, well, this is a dream in which you're bringing different forces of the population as represented by different colors together in some sort of fluid and harmonious relation to one another, until you get up close to it and you see what it's made of. Can we go to the next image?
Wow.
They're all dinosaurs.
No way.
They're all dinosaurs. And there are all these swirling animal dinosaur forms swirling around Chairman Mao, and you realize behind this sort of dream of unification and peaceful organization and order, there are all these dinosaurs divided by color sort of tracking along. And then you can't help but think, what if one of them panics? Or one of the colors decides that they don't like the direction of the movement? Then what? Can we go back for a sec? This kind of, you can imagine this harmonious order of Chinese society as in this kind of integrated, beautiful image. Now go forward again. If these very prehistoric forces break loose in the collective psyche, you've got some trouble on your hands. This is a very sardonic image of the Chinese collective psyche. And what I'm trying to say by showing this image is the idea of the collective psyche is a universal idea. And whether people call it by the collective psyche or not, it's a very strong thread that runs from culture to culture, expressing itself perhaps in different forms in different cultures, but it's very real and very powerful. Now, I want to go sort of taking the Rauschenberg image and the image of Mao's Dream of Reason to the next image. Unfortunately, this is, I don't know if you can see this. Laurel tried to help me last night by relabeling this because the labels are so small. I don't know if I can, I guess I can't get up and move around here. Okay. Well, I don't know to pick up my voice.
Oh, we'll pick up your voice.
Yeah, so maybe I can speak from here. This was a diagram that was drawn by Jung, and this comes from the 1920s. This was Jung's diagram of the psyche from in 1926. And if you look at this diagram, if you can see it, right up here at the top, he's got the individual. And then just below it, and that's above the surface of the water. And then just below it, B, are families. And below that is C, which are clans. And below that, D, is nations. And below that, E, are large groups like European man. And below that are primate ancestors. And below that are animal ancestors in general. And at the bottom, he's got the central fire, what he calls the central fire. I never knew what that was until I went to the Galapagos, and which is volcanic. And I looked up at the volcanic mountain, and I was sitting on the beach, and I saw all these different creatures sort of sharing this space. And I thought, well, Darwin got the idea of the central fire of evolution in the Galapagos, and Jung got the idea of the central fire, some primal energetic force in nature, life force itself, if you will, and in geology. And Jung intuited this at the very bottom of things. Now, Jung's genius, in my mind, was that he did a fantastic job somewhere between the central fire and maybe up to E or D. He really understood the archetypal substrata or foundation of who we are as a species and the forces, the primal forces that move us. Murray was talking about it today in terms of Wotan, that kind of archetypal riverbeds. Where I think Jung fell down, at least in my mind, or he didn't fall down, it's that his emphasis was on this archetypal layers of the human psyche. And he was also interested in the individual. But by and large, because of, are we all right?
Yes, looking for you. I'm so sorry.
We're panning.
I'm down in the central fire there. So, but if you listen to Murray carefully, and if and when he talks about Wotan and the archetypal nature of what was seizing European man in the 30s, and you read Wotan as I did, with the same, I think, excitement and interest that Murray did, what you realize over time is, and it's actually one of my favorite essays in all of Jung's writing, it was profoundly misunderstood. It's actually the article that's often cited by people who feel Jung was anti-Semitic and that he was identified with the Nazi movement. If you read the essay carefully, you'll see Jung very carefully warning about the danger of intoxication and possession by Wotan. There's no question that's there. The problem is the energy with which he wrote that essay, the excitement with which he wrote that essay that kind of moves through that, made some people read it as if he was possessed by Wotan and he was taken over by Wotan. I think it's an incorrect reading. However, it really tells you the power of an archetypal force to seize the ego and put it out of the way so that you don't even read the article in the correct way, or you don't actually read what he's saying, because you're taken up with the archetypal energy of Wotan as this powerful force. And I have maintained over the last several years at least, not that Wotan isn't a wonderful essay, and not that I don't think it's correct. It's one of the best things Jung ever did, but it's also the source of tremendous problems. It was a source of tremendous problems for Jung personally in terms of how he was misunderstood. But even more importantly than that, it's created a tremendous problem for the Jungian tradition. Because what happened is Jung was accused of anti-Semitism. His articles on national character were roundly criticized as racist and anti-Semitic. And Jung himself, although he had this very active, engaged time of his life politically during the 30s, he basically found himself withdrawing from that active engagement in the world, particularly in his later life. He had less to say about it, and he was tremendously burned, I think, by the way in which he was misunderstood. I think the Jungian tradition picked up on that and shied away from carrying out the promise of the Jungian tradition in terms of its ability to relate to and speak to and comment on the collective psyche. It was a profoundly introverted tradition to begin with, and as Bernard was talking about the split between introverted and extroverted, the Jungians became the introverted path for individuals, and the goal almost at times seemed to be you need to differentiate out of the collective, which was seen as a shadow that would simply devour one by the needs of the masses and a loss of individuality. So I'm not saying this is actually what Jung meant, but Jung and those who followed them often turned away from the collective as being dismembering, in the same way that if you got too identified with Rauschenberg's image, you could be swallowed up in that fragmenting collective. And the task of individuation was to separate out from the collective, which was seen really as the shadow almost. That the collective became the shadow for the Jungian tradition. Now, that wasn't the intention, and certainly Murray spoke to Jung saying that if you introvert, you owe a debt to society to pay it back. And I think that's absolutely true, too. But the tradition itself tended to become more and more identified with introversion and individuation, and had less and less meaningful to say about the collective and the collective psyche. And I think it's been a real problem. And I think a lot of it could have been avoided. If you read Wotan, if I were going to sit down with Jung, not Barack Obama, and give him some advice, I would tell Jung, look, this Wotan is terrific, but you left out a really big piece. And the reason you're going to be misunderstood is that you didn't talk enough in here about what the German people were suffering. The sense of profound demoralization that they had following World War I, the economic collapse, the sense of humiliation. And so that the reason they were ripe for a seizure from below at an archetypal level was because the collective psyche and what I call the cultural complexes were profoundly traumatized by World War I. And if I were going to tell Jung what to do, I would say, put in a middle section in Wotan and speak about what happened to the Germans after World War I and why the population as a whole and why the collective psyche as a whole was so prone to being taken over by this possession. You see, I think the problem is the Jungian tradition focused on the archetypal and the individual, and it left out the cultural and sort of the social as being something that we simply wanted to differentiate out from. Now, this isn't universal. It's not the only story. One could tell very different stories, but it's a theme and it's a trend in our tradition. So, into this intermediate zone between the individual and the archetypal, Joseph Henderson, who was a very revered senior analyst in the Jungian tradition in San Francisco, died at the age of 104 just a few years ago. He posited a separate sphere of psychic activity. There's the personal unconscious, there's a collective unconscious, and this intermediate range he called the cultural unconscious. And in the area of the cultural unconscious, Joseph Henderson did a study of a sort of typological study. Different people adjust to the cultural unconscious through different attitudes: a social attitude, an aesthetic attitude, a religious attitude, a philosophical attitude. I can't remember them all, but he sort of did a typology of the cultural unconscious. But the problem with Henderson, whose work I'm deeply indebted to, I saw him for years, is that he left out, I think, one of the most important parts of Jung's most creative work, which actually came at the very beginning of his career, which is his complex theory. And actually in the 30s, when there was a tradition building up around Jung, some people, in fact Jung himself, rather than calling it analytical psychology, thought that they should call it complex psychology. Complex theory was at the heart of Jung's earliest work, and when he was working with schizophrenic people in Bergholze, it was that work that drew Freud's attention to him, because he saw splinter personalities as fragmenting the psyche of the individual, and he called these complexes. I'm going to give you some characteristics of complexes, because the work that Sam Kimball's and I did initially together was to take this intermediate zone of the cultural unconscious, and we posited in that zone an area of cultural complexes. You have personal complexes that are formed by early childhood experiences and parental problems and traumas and so on. But there's another area of complexes which is less mediated by the family and personal experience and more mediated and informed, and the contents of which come from the cultural level of the psyche. And so my work and our work has really been at this level of what we call cultural complexes. Now, the reason I'm going into all of this is because I'm going to present Obama's presidency and his struggles in terms of this theory of, and it's just a theory, it's a working hypothesis, of cultural complexes. It's kind of how I understand the difficulties that he has, the forces that he's struggling with, and the tremendous opportunities that he's at times been able to realize. But it all springs from this theory of the cultural complex. And the theory says that cultural complexes are every bit as real, every bit as formative, every bit as ubiquitous, and every bit as powerful in their emotional and behavioral impact on individuals and groups as are personal complexes. So it's a whole separate realm of complexes that exist both in the psyche of the individual, but also in the psyche of the collective. Or you could say that in the psyche of the individual there is a stream of the collective psyche, and that stream of the collective psyche is made up of cultural complexes. So each one of us has our personal complexes, but we also have our cultural complexes, and in the social order itself, cultural complexes are playing themselves out every day. And once you start to think in terms of this theory, you can look at a newspaper and you can just write down which cultural complexes are parading across the newspaper on any particular day. Where I want to go now, so my argument about Wotan is, one, I love it, two, I think it's absolutely real and true, and three, it caused Jung terrible problems, and his psychology terrible problems, because it's sort of, in terms of the Jungian cultural complex, the riverbed of anti-Semitism that was struck by Jung's comments or his accusations of anti-Semitism made that sort of dry up in him. He really took a different direction then, and he started speaking less of the collective psyche, less of this level of the culture, and seeing it as something more that one differentiates out from. So I think his brilliant essay cost our tradition a lot. And that's the problem really with the Jungian tradition, if you will, is that if you get too focused on the archetypal level and too focused on the individual level, you miss out on something that we all swim in every day, which is our belonging to families and our belonging to groups of people and our being parts of nations and parts of the Western tradition, and that we can't get too one-sided. We could become equally reductive by thinking only in terms of cultural complexes. But I think we've become too reductive as a tradition by thinking only in terms of archetypal forces. I think it's a danger, and it's that danger that I'm trying to speak to in this concept of the cultural complex. Let me give you the characteristics of a cultural complex as I understand them, and this is really taken from work that Chauncey Irvine and I did together in the 70s and 80s when we were teaching at Langley Porter, and this is really Chauncey, I don't know if any of you know Chauncey, but she was a wonderfully clear thinker and a wonderful clinician and a wonderful person. She had a very clear and organized mind, and this is really her list sort of expanded by me. Complexes express themselves in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors. They are highly charged emotional. A highly charged emotional or affective reactivity is their calling card. You know when you've stepped on a complex, personal or cultural, when somebody gets really upset with you. And I have never given a talk on cultural complexes without triggering one in somebody. They're actually very difficult to talk about because they're so powerful and they're so reactive in their emotionality. They resist our most heroic efforts at consciousness, and they remain for the most part unconscious. They accumulate experiences that validate their point of view and create a storehouse of self-affirming ancestral memories. That's a really important part, because if you start to track a complex like racism in the United States, you realize that it's got memory upon memory upon memory. And it just builds like a snowball. And if you touch the complex, you're not just getting an individual's reaction, you're getting an individual's family's reaction and their ancestors' reaction, and it's all coming up at you in some very powerful emotional outburst or wave that sort of wipes both of you out in terms of human beings able to relate to one another. Personal and cultural complexes function in an involuntary, autonomous fashion and tend to affirm a simplistic point of view that replaces more everyday ambiguity and uncertainty with fixed, often self-righteous attitudes to the world. If you touch a complex in a Israeli or in a Palestinian, and it's got this virulent history of antagonism and conflict, or a black and a white person in this country, or any number of groups that we can think of, not only do you get the wave of affect and ancestral memory, but you also get very fixed, righteous opinions, which are inflexible and unmovable, and there's no point in continuing the discussion until it kind of settles down. Finally, in this characteristics of cultural complexes, the argument runs, or the theory runs, they have archetypal cores. That is, they express typically human attitudes and are rooted in primordial ideas about what is meaningful, making them very hard to resist, reflect upon, and discriminate. So like the theory of personal complexes, we postulate that there's an archetypal core at the heart of a complex, and I'll demonstrate that to you a little bit later. So I think of cultural complexes as the fundamental building blocks of what we can think of as an inner sociology. An inner sociology does not claim to be objective or scientific in its description of different groups and classes of people. Rather, it's a description of groups and classes of people as filtered through the psyches of generations of ancestors. It contains an abundance of information and misinformation about the structure of societies. So it's really truly an inner sociology, and the central components of that inner sociology are cultural complexes. So if you think, I mean, we all sort of like sociology, and sociology has become the mainstream of what politicians rely upon in terms of who they try to appeal to and how people are going to vote and so on. But if you think of an inner sociology, we have an elaborate inner world of the relationship between groups of people based on our own early experiences, the experiences of our parents, the experiences of generations before that, the color of our skin, the nature of our religious beliefs or non-beliefs. We have a warehouse, a storehouse of information about ourselves as groups of people and about other groups of people. You can think of them as those different colored dinosaurs in the Chinese image. Now, using this kind of theoretical model, I want to briefly talk about, in this section, about Obama and playing the race card during the Democratic primary. And when you talk about Obama, or you talk about individuation, or you talk about politics and symbols, In a way, who are we talking about? Are we talking about Obama as an individual? Well, probably not. Are we talking about Obama as a nation? Probably not, although more so than as an individual. We're certainly talking about him as a Democrat. Are we talking about Obama as a world leader? Yes. Are we talking about large groups of people and nations? Yes. When we talk about individuation, whose individuation are we talking about? Are we talking about Obama as a president? Are we talking about ourselves as a people? Are we talking about the world as a whole? So individuation as an umbrella term is confusing. And I would suggest we want to think clearly about who we're talking about when we take the very legitimate concept of individuation and apply it to something as vast as Obama's presidency. In the same way that Murray suggested, what did he suggest that about? Can you take the concepts of individual psychology and apply them to group psychology? I mean, basically, I'm taking Jung's complex theory and applying it to groups. I've taken Jung's idea of the transcendent function and applying it to groups. Murray's written some beautiful articles on individuation in Latin American countries, and he too likes to use our concepts that developed out of individual psychology and experiment with them in terms of larger groups of people. They may or may not be useful, and we have to decide that over time. To give a really vivid example of a cultural complex and Obama, and it sort of lays the heart of my thesis out for you, I'm going to quote from Toni Morrison's Beloved, which maybe many of you have read or are familiar with, but Toni Morrison has given the best description of a cultural complex that I've ever read. And I'm going to read it, and I hope it's not too long, but it'll give you a feel for how it functions in the collective psyche through an extremely gifted narrator's eye. She's talking about one of her characters in Beloved. He believed the undecipherable language clamoring around the house was the mumbling of the black and angry dead. Very few had died in bed, and none that he knew of had lived a livable life. Even the educated colored, the so-called long school people, the doctors, the teachers, the paper writers, and businessmen, had a hard row to hoe. In addition to having to use their heads to get ahead, they had the weight of the whole race sitting there. You needed two heads for that. White people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle. Swift, unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. In a way, he thought they were right. The more colored people spent their strength trying to convince them, the whites, how gentle they were, how clever and loving, how human, the more they used themselves up to persuade rights of something Negroes believe could not be questioned. The deeper and more tangled the jungle grew inside. He's talking about something that's happening both in white people and black people around race. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them to this place from the other livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them. It's not Africa. It's the unconscious of white people projecting onto the blacks. And it grew, it spread. In, through, and after life, it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it. Touched them, every one, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than they ever even wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. Well, that's cultural complex. And what Toni Morrison is saying is that it lives through ancestors. It infects, in this case, two groups of people who are caught up in it. And one doesn't know who's got the red gums and who's the swinging baboons and which jungle they're coming from, because it's filled with fear and hatred. The question came up earlier today from Asheville about Obama and race and what archetypal riverbeds were touched by Obama's being a black man. This is the riverbed Toni Morrison's done the riverbed for us, and it's a very virulent, very terrifying place that we all do our best to try and steer clear of as best we can. Now, the cultural complex of race, with its mumbling voices of the black and angry dead and the screaming baboon under their own white skin, came alive during the Democratic primary in 2008. And as you all probably recall, originally Obama didn't want to be identified as a black man or a white man. He wanted to play the race card by not playing the race card, by having a candidacy that was beyond race. And that was his intention, and that's the way it went until he won in Iowa. As soon as he actually became a credible candidate, the race card started to kind of pronounce itself. Clinton made some outrageous, Bill Clinton down in South Carolina, about Obama winning down there, Asheville, I guess, or is that North Carolina? North Carolina. Excuse me, Asheville. Made comments about Obama's success in the South based on large black populations down there, and sort of dismissed Obama as, well, he'll do well down here. Jesse Jackson did too, but it's not going to last because there are other places. And later in the campaign, Hillary Clinton talked about the poor working people, which was code name for white working class people in West Virginia when her campaign was going down the tubes, and she did her very best to play the race card. And what politicians do with cultural complexes, by and large, is they play them. They manipulate them. They like to mobilize the powerful, unconscious, untransformable affects to use, again, for one people against another group of people. They do that more often than not, particularly when they're desperate. That's what they do. They play cultural complexes. They're very shrewd about that. They understand it. They know it in their bones. And that's what they resort to when they're in trouble. So all of that was fine until actually the race card blew up in Obama's face, not from the Clintons, but from his own minister, from his own religious community, who made some egregious comments about how AIDS was purposefully given to black people, and 9/11 was an appropriate response of the world to America's sinfulness. Well, this is right in the middle of Obama's campaign for the Democratic nomination, and his own minister, for whatever, God knows whatever reasons, just about blew his campaign out of the water. And that's when Obama, I think, rose to the level of being presidential. It's when he took the cultural complex of race, black against white, and in Philadelphia gave a speech that I would argue is the transcendent function at work in the body politic. And I want to just do this really briefly if I can. I want to quote just a few pieces, several pieces actually, from his speech. In terms, somebody asked, would Obama understand analytical psychology, or has he read it? Well, I read Obama's Philadelphia speech as an analytical psychologist. And I took parts of his speech and related them to the 5 characteristics of cultural complexes. I don't think Obama's read my book, and I don't think I have much to teach or tell Obama about cultural complexes, because I think he knows it in his bones already. So it's, for whatever reason, he knows all about this stuff. But let me translate for you cultural complex in terms of what Obama said in his Philadelphia speech and see if it works for you. A cultural complex expresses itself in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors, both in a group as a whole and in its individual members. Highly charged emotional or affective reactivity is the calling card of a cultural complex. Here's what Obama said in Philadelphia. A legacy of defeat was passed on to future generations of blacks, those young men and increasingly young women whom we see standing on street corners or languishing in our prisons without hope or prospects for the future. For the men and women of Reverend Wright's generation, the memories of humiliation and doubt and fear have not gone away, nor has the anger and bitterness of those years. Well, that's the cultural complex in terms of being filled with powerful emotion and repetitive behavior, which I think Reverend Wright acted out. But then I think Obama's brilliance was not just to speak to the anguish of the blacks. He said, most working and middle-class white Americans don't feel that they have been particularly privileged by their race. They are anxious about their futures and feel their dreams slipping away, so when they are told to bus their children to a school across town, when they hear that an African American is getting an advantage in landing a good job or a spot in a good college because of an injustice they themselves never committed, the white people, when they're told that their fears about crime in urban neighborhoods are somehow prejudice, resentment builds over time. He spoke to the complex of white people. He spoke to both sides in a very real way. He has both sides in him. What I would argue is that a great political leader actually has experienced both sides of the cultural complexes that are most potent in their societies, and rather than manipulate the complex to play one side off against another, they can actually speak to both sides of that, carry it in themselves in a real way, and for me, that's the transcendent function. The transcendent function holds both sides of the cultural complex, gives each its due in terms of the emotional reactivity of the complex, and transcends it by acknowledging both and bringing them both together with the potential for a new relationship. That was really Obama's genius for me in that speech. A cultural complex resists our most heroic efforts at consciousness and remains for the most part unconscious. Obama says, the fact is that the comments that have been made and the issues that have surfaced over the last few weeks, he's talking about Reverend Wright, reflect the complexities of race in this country that we've never really worked through. Well, that's the same as saying it resists our most heroic efforts and consciousness and remain for the most part unconscious. We never work through them. A cultural complex accumulates experiences, it validates its own point of view and creates a storehouse of self-affirming ancestral memories. He quotes William Faulkner, Obama does in his speech. The past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past. We do not need to recite here the history of racial injustice in this country, but we do need to remind ourselves that so many of the disparities that exist in the African American community today can be directly traced to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation that suffered under the brutal legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Let's see here. And then I'm just going to do one more thing. Cultural complexes have archetypal cores, that is, they express typically human attitudes and are rooted in primordial ideas about what is meaningful, making them very hard to resist, reflect on, and discriminate. Obama says the Declaration of Independence, that's our archetypal core, if you will, as an American people. Declaration of Independence is about who we are as a people. That's our archetype, or that's the cultural manifestation of who we are as a people. That's our core value. That's the archetypal primal principle of our being as a nation. But, he says, it was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery, a question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 more years and to leave any final resolution to future generations. So he's speaking both to the archetypal core of the Declaration of Independence, how it was flawed, and therefore we inherited, in a sense, in our collective psyche, the injustices that were actually contained within it. So, the final piece of this first section is the transcendent function. In a way, I've already said it, except I want to say what Jung said about the transcendent function. And here's where Jung is speaking. He's speaking here about individual psychology. And I'm taking what Jung said about individual psychology and translating it to collective psychology. He says, if we can successfully develop the function which I have called transcendent, the disharmony ceases and we can then enjoy the favorable side of the unconscious. The unconscious then gives us all the encouragement and help that a bountiful nature can shower upon man. It holds possibilities which are locked away from the conscious mind, for it has at its disposal all subliminal psychic contents, all those things which have been forgotten or overlooked. as well as the wisdom and experience of uncounted centuries which are laid down in its archetypal organs. This is the exact opposite of the riverbeds of possession that flood and seize the psyche. This is the transcendent function. It's doing just the opposite. And what I would argue is in Obama's Philadelphia speech and in, I think, the excitement that his race for president aroused in many of us, it was because that he spoke to and from the transcendent function, and then the promise was the unconscious then gives all the encouragement and helps that a bountiful nature can shower upon man. And out of that, he said, if we pull together as a people, we can do things about education, we can do things about Iraq, we can do things about health care. So he was really speaking about the bountiful nature of America that could be tapped if we brought these cultural complexes, if you will, into some sort of creative dialogue with one another. So that's the transcendent function. So we've got collective psyche, we've got cultural complex, and we've got transcendent function. And I'll stop for a minute and take a breather.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Tom. There's so much material you're pulling together with all this. What I thought we might do is I've got two questions, really more like comments from the email world I'd like to read off and elicit any response from you. And then maybe we can do a question or two from each site and go with that, if that's okay. There's two questions I'd like to present, comments really. First one's from India, second one's from France. Kind of gives you a nice sense of our world relatedness. This is from Lena. She's in Bangalore, India. Hi, this is Lena from Bangalore. Thank you, Asheville, for a very interesting seminar. It's past midnight here, and I'm going to try and listen to Tom's talk in a while. So God bless her for going past midnight and listening to the talk, but she's hopefully hanging in there. I was very interested in what Bernard had to say about the apocalyptic effect that seems to be gripping the world. While that seems to be so, I have seen, like most people in this region, the most terrible grief and sadness that cyclones, drought, tsunamis, and floods wreak on the poorest of the poor who live on the riverbanks near the seashore. These are folks who depend on the waters for their livelihood in the land which suffers from the lack of irrigation and severely hot summers. When they are evacuated from the riverbanks, for instance, they move, as it were, to higher ground, literally. And when the waters subside, leaving its trail of such utter sadness, these people continue to live by the river, for it is their livelihood in more than the material sense. Their histories are tied up in it. Their myths and legends and stories are connected to it, as is the land. And so they live there and return. So yes, as the film and other Hollywood movies reflect the apocalyptic effect, there is, it seems, the reinforcing of the human spirit as well, as the psyche reaffirms the symbol-making function in the lives of these simple folks. Thanks again for a very interesting seminar. Warmly, Lena. The riverbed, yet again a powerful image of that riverbed. Any comment on that? That's really just a thought, but any comment before I move on?
It's really nice that somebody in India is awake at midnight and sharing with us. It's kind of amazing to me, and it means that we sort of share a global riverbed at this point.
Mm-hmm. Very much so, very much. And the connectedness, the whole being connected in tragedy. I mean, Pakistan being so close to that and the river flooding, and we see these images of misery night after night with that. It's powerful to hear somebody connecting with us in the very midst of that. The other comment I wanted to read from France before we open it up to other questions, this comes from Jane in France. I would suggest that the deep, dry riverbeds, yet another riverbed comment, the deep, dry riverbeds have been receptive to the lava flow of the anti-Obama forces in the Tea Party. The archetypal American figure of the lone cowboy who owes no taxes or forces or loyalty to any authority. The hero with his guns, obedient only to his own law, and the master of the wilderness who owes his success to no one but himself. These are our cultural archetypal images. And interesting, that's the image from France of the U.S. Archetype, in essence. Any comments with that?
Well, I think she's if it's a she or he, whoever.
I think she, Jane.
Jane, yes, is absolutely right. What I would say is that to understand why that cowboy image is so important now, that's the archetypal image, or at least the American archetypal image, if you will. Let's look at what makes people identify with that. And I would suggest, in the same way that Jung did not look at why the German population was so open to possession and caused him to be misunderstood, if we simply get angry at the cowboy image, we're failing to understand that these neo-cowboys are desperately afraid and that their way of life is profoundly threatened. And so they take on this sort of macho, heroic, independent point of view. I think it's a compensation for an unconscious fear that we're being swept away by very powerful forces that they're not sure how to adjust to. And I suspect if you looked at our modern cowboy, you'll find more fear than you will real bravery, if you will. So the point is, the comment can lead us to scoff at the cowboy. Mm-hmm. And then we're actually not doing what I'm arguing is, why is the archetypal image functioning now? Why are the Tea Party people so upset? What's got them mobilized? What are they afraid of? Where are they not being heard? Mm-hmm. Because, it looks so, from where I sit, they look so, Sarah Palin looks like a dummy. How can anybody be excited about Sarah Palin and her bears? But they are. She's speaking to something, and we better take it very seriously. That's my response.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't we take a question from Asheville, if there is one, and then we'll transfer back to Sonoma. Any questions from the crowd here? Asheville. Go ahead.
I'll ask one. I'm, and this is going to something much more theoretical, but I'm an anthropologist, and I'm interested in, at one point in your talk, you talked about applying, and I'm going to get the language wrong, but because I'm not a Jungian, but I'm interested, applying sort of individual processes onto collective or onto groups. But I found myself wondering, are you really trying to see the way individuals internalize group processes? So I'm interested in kind of the location of this. Is the collective conscious or the complex out there sort of as an emergent property of sociality? Or is it an internalized function of an individual who has picked up this information from the group or the group dynamics and is then expressing it? So what is the location? It's almost an ontological question. What's the location of the complex? Is it inside an individual having internalized the group, or is it in the group? And maybe that isn't very interesting to you, but I find myself.
No, it's a beautifully formulated question, and it's an elegant formulation of a question. It's something I do think about a lot, and I would argue that it's both and, that it's located both inside, but it's all over the place outside too. And once you tune into it, you can see it inside yourself, and then you look outside, and it's alive in the media. That's where we get a lot of this kind of psychic stream or collective psyche. So my answer to you would be both and. It's both located inside and outside. It's not split. It's we swim in it. We swim in it. I think of psyche as something we swim in, inside and outside. And particularly the collective psyche. It's inside us, and we swim in it outside every day. That's what I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. I guess maybe anthropology calls that culture. In some ways we internalize culture, and we swim in this culture out there, and it sort of seems fitting that somebody of your persuasion would talk about it in terms of psyche that would be out there and inside, and an anthropologist might speak of it in terms of culture that might be inside and outside. But maybe we're just being semantical now. So,
well, we call it a cultural complex. So I think in that sense, I may be misusing culture in terms of what an anthropologist would say. But I do think I would call it culture too. I would call it culture and psyche. Both.
Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. Go ahead and take a few questions in Sonoma if you'd like, and then you can continue your talk.
I feel stupid because I don't really know a lot about the I'm just learning, but I'm supposed to talk into this thing here, right?
Okay. Push the button. Okay, I have a green light. Go. I understand everything that you're saying. So my question is it possible for us to be able to reach this transcendent function for the collective unconscious to individuate? We're talking about individuation, and we're talking about the collective unconscious, and we're talking about it being within, and we're talking about it being without. So is there a place where it can all come together? I mean, that's pretty much what we're talking about, though. And so I'm confused about how that might happen with all the differences in. I mean, one of my other questions that I had was, there is no American culture. I don't know what the collective unconscious of American culture is, because we're a melting pot of multiple consciousness. So I don't know if this is answerable or whether it should even be questioned. So, is it possible for us to come to a point where, we can merge all of this together into one whole thing, which will, of course, turn into something else, but...
Well, it's an excellent question, and I think you're confused because it is confusing.
Yes.
And, what's inside and what's outside, and what's individual and what's collective, and individuation, as Jungians have traditionally talked about, it really is an individual process.
Right.
That much we can say with certainty.
Right.
You can start talking about individuation of a nation or even of a world. You can dream about it, which I think is the dream of Obama, is, if you will, an individuated world.
Right.
And of course, one gets pretty rapidly disillusioned because that dream is so both elusive and probably unrealized. It is unrealizable.
Right.
However, I think about something like gay marriage actually comes to mind, because if you look at where we were as a collective culture 50 years ago, and what's happening around the issue of gay marriage in California and the rest of the United States, it is truly remarkable how much the collective psyche has embraced something that seems so shadowy and so distasteful and even evil to many people, and evolved in a way that has a quality of individuation about it at a cultural level.
Right, okay, I can see that.
So I think your question is excellent, and one needs to try and exercise sort of a differentiated mind and say, I think about it over here and I think about it over there, and sometimes there's a relationship between the two and sometimes there isn't. But it's worth thinking about. A lot of people felt that, for instance, the Vietnam War was part of America's individuation in terms of learning that we couldn't do whatever we wanted in the world, although we didn't seem to learn the lesson, and that we were in that was an adolescent phase, and we were going to come out of that and be something else.
No, we're still
but
not
we
grown
didn't
up.
seem to learn the lesson,
No.
if you will. So what was the second part of your question?
I'm not sure. Yeah, is it even something, because in one sense, there is an awakening. There is a cultural awakening about how things need to be changed. And because of the disparity of the collective and the individuals that make up the collective and everything that they bring along with that from their cultural perspectives, is it even possible for us to have a homogeneous idea of ourselves? What is an American? What is an American?
Well, yeah,
What makes an American?
How can we even talk about an American culture when we're so different? But,
Right.
Every place you turn now, diversity is sort of the number one priority of everything. So as a country, we're trying to embrace diversity as part of who we are as Americans.
Right.
So multiplicity and diversity are buzzwords, or even politically correct buzzwords, about the attempt to redefine who we are as a people in a very new way. And is it possible? I actually don't think so. I believe in the power of cultural complexes. I think that the anti-Semitism has been around for a couple thousand years. I don't think it's going to go away. I'm not particularly hopeful about truce between Palestine and Israel at this point. I don't think racism is going to go away. I think there are all sorts of things that we live with that are very deep-seated. We're like the dinosaurs in that Chinese thing. You know, you try and sort of move along in the best way you can without your particular color of dinosaur eating up somebody else's dinosaur.
Right.
I mean, that's the way I think about it.
Right. I agree with you.
Yes.
There are maps, though. I'm really struck by the 2 times that you used analogies from literature, which speak to the feeling function and the affective functions to help not only make the image real, but to give a life experience where you can be in the person's shoes, and whether you're black or white, in terms of the beloved, you got in touch with the kinds of feelings that you had in both kinds of situations, yeah? Likewise, when you mentioned the Wotan article, I was really struck, it was a coincidence, a synchronicity, but after Bush was elected, I started reading Heinrich Böll, who has written extensively on the life of the German people, some really remarkable books. And he describes in very vivid detail, what the struggle for individuals to sustain their humanity in spite of the fact that what was happening to them was like a collective concentration camp in reverse. And I think there's a very interesting parallel between Viktor Frankl's book about man's search for meaning and his sustaining his humanism in a concentration camp, and Heinrich Böll talking about the cultural collective, actually identifying personal stories that describe what you're saying. So my point is, for myself, one of the maps that I have tried to create is to go back and forth between great works of literature, especially about cultural conflicts, and try to see the story almost as a Jungian therapist would do, a dance between what the brain, the thinking function can know, and what the intuitive function needs to let go of these constructs in our mind that if we can't put it in a thinking function, then we don't know how to connect the pieces. But that's not true. We still can connect the pieces. So I'm not Pollyanna, and I'm not trying to say to Debbie, oh, well, this is the way you can take care of that issue. But I am sharing that I think it's interesting that you twice used examples of literature which gave a very alive feel and an intuitive sense of the concept you were trying to present. And that's one of the reasons I'm in this program, and that's one of the reasons that I believe in the Jungian approach to problem solving, because I think there is a dance between the psyche that moves in literature and the psyche that moves in individual minds and the thinking function. And for me, I think embracing that dance is really important, and the work that you've described is, to me, I love the affirmation that I feel about how that works. The dance between literature and then how it affects individual lives.
Well, thank you very much for the comment. Actually, I'm going to take the dance image one step further. I've begun to think of political process as a dance between cultural complexes, and that soul making at the level of the body politic is when the cultural complexes are engaged and allowed to dance in the way that Obama did in his Philadelphia speech. That was a dance. He was moving back and forth between two highly conflicted points of view in the most graceful way, and he showed us as a people how we might dance with apparently intractable problems that simply remained divisive. And in a way, to me, that's the great. And I at one point prior to the election wrote up the 7 cultural complexes that define us as a country, and asked myself whether soul-making was happening with those cultural complexes based on whether the issues were actually being engaged by both sides or not. And so I think it's worth thinking about the body politic as engaging in a dance of cultural complexes. Most of the time it's rather stiff. You know, it hasn't gone to dancing school. Civilization has not gone to dancing school. I want to move on because we have. I want to show you another dance, and I want to introduce this dance. This is sort of part two, and we'll get as far as we can. Steve, are we all right? Are you there?
Yeah, we're fine. Go ahead. That sounds great.
Okay. This is a really exciting thing for me to introduce because 3 or 4 years ago I was contacted by a young Australian documentary filmmaker named Peter Hegedus who wanted to make a film on the American dream, and for a variety of reasons. And we had communication back and forth between... Wait, I don't want to start yet. And so Peter's been working on the, and a year ago he was here and he interviewed me for a day, and we went to a ball game together to sort of see the American dream at play. And then I didn't hear from Peter for a year until about 2 weeks ago, and he sent me sort of the rough cut of his finished documentary film just in time for us. And he's going to premiere this film in the Sundance Film Festival in January of this year, but he sent along 3 film clips. So we're seeing the world premiere of the film clips from My America. And I want you to think of Peter both as a very unique individual on the one hand, and as everyman on the other hand. He's both and. And to introduce this, Peter sent me at 3 this morning. He said he would like this to be introduced in the following way. A film by Peter Hegedus and produced by Jane Jeffries, Trish Lake, and Peter Hegedus. So there are 3 people producing it, and he is the sort of director, main person, and he's the star of the film too, although the world and Obama are also the star. So I'm going to show you these. We're going to show you these 3 clips, which is going to move the discussion of the case of Obama onto the world stage in a slightly different way. Okay.
And rolling.
AD marker, take 2.
Thank you. And set.
I'm feeling a bit nervous.
Well, you've been on a very big journey so far.
And it's not over. I mean, it's this obsession. You know, I love America, I hate America. That's the 2 things I'm going between.
Do you feel like you're chasing some childhood dream that's irrelevant?
It feels like I'm chasing an experience that wasn't real. And I'm making a film about it. You know?
I want to know more about the 14-year-old dream. I think that would be really important to try and tease out.
14-year-old dream. I guess my obsession with America started way back in Hungary, where I lived until I was 14. Back then, in the 1970s, Hungary was communist, part of the Soviet bloc. My parents divorced when I was 6. My sister and I stayed with Mum. Dad went to America to study. I hated school. I hated having to learn Russian. I was hopeless at it. I had red hair, I was shy, and I was bullied. My great escape was American movies. I saw every American action movie that came out. To me, they were about truth, justice, in the American way. The bad guys were often Russian. The good guys were always American. My childhood heroes were President Ronald Reagan, Sylvester Stallone, and especially Arnold Schwarzenegger. They wiped out the bad guys, protected the weak, and made my world a safe place. Arnie was my favorite.
Just do what I tell you. I'm counting on you, buddy. Don't let me down.
I wanted him to rescue me so I could go to America and save the world too.
So, Peter grew up in Hungary under a communist regime, and he moved to Australia, and he became a filmmaker. The power of the story is even further underlined by the fact that his grandfather was the youngest prime minister in the history of Hungary. And when the Hungarians started to rebel in 1956 and there was civil unrest, his grandfather invited the Russian troops to come in, and that's when Hungary became Russian. So the country felt, I think it's fair to say, betrayed by his grandfather. He went off to Australia and made a film first about his grandfather, and this is his, I think, second major film. And he loved America as a boy. He thought America would free his country from its being bullied by Russia and perhaps free himself from being bullied as a young boy. And then when 9/11 came, he was his impulse was to have deep feeling for America and to love America even more. And then Bush was president, but then the whole thing took a direction that was profoundly disillusioning to him. And so he wanted to make a film about the betrayal of his American dream. And as he was starting to make the film, Obama got elected. I came across this image, which is something that Diane Sherwood, who edits is the editor of the Young Journal in San Francisco. I think it's called the Young Journal. It used to be called the Library Journal. Now it's called the Young Journal. I wrote an article a few years ago now on unconscious forces in international affairs, or some such title like that, in which I wrote about what I call archetypal defenses of the group spirit. And I think, I'll explain this image a bit to you. It's complicated. Diane and her husband did a wonderful job of translating my thoughts into this image, and it actually contains the theory of cultural complexes, and it also contains the image that I think Obama really wanted to dismantle for all of us, or for many of us. And the image is based on the idea that when a group is threatened at the core of its being, as I think the Islamic world has been for some 500 years, because it's suffered enormous humiliation for a long period of time. And America was, with 9/11, that was about as deep a threat to our being as we've suffered as a country, maybe ever. I don't think we were ever bombed in this country before by foreign invaders. Is that right? Pearl Harbor, yeah, but that was Hawaii. That's America, but it's a state now. Thank you. When did it become a state?
After Obama was born.
After Obama was born. Does that mean he's an American? Well, anyway, the idea is that when a group of people, this is actually based on Don Kalshed's theory of trauma and individuals, but I've taken Kalshed's theory, and as I did with the transcendent function and the complex theory, I've thought about it in terms of group behavior, which may or may not work. that if you think of the group as having a spirit, whether it be a high school football team or the San Francisco Giants baseball team and the city of San Francisco, or the country of America, if you think that there's something called a group spirit, which I happen to think there is, if that group spirit is attacked at the core of its being, the most immediate and natural response, which somebody quoted earlier today, they wished, Thich Nhat Hanh wished that we would take a little time before responding, but we didn't take time before responding. We had a response probably planned well before the bomb anyway, or the bombing of the World Trade Center. But the most natural thing, an amoeba, a single cell organism, if you touch it, it will recoil and try and figure out a way to deposit something on you as an invading organism that will destroy you. The most basic biological thing for an organism that's attacked is to defend itself and counterattack. That's just what happens in biology. That's what happens. Murray was talking about the territorial imperative, I think, earlier this morning, and the origins of war. Why do we go to war? Well, there's the territorial imperative. We were attacked at the core of our being, and that's 9/11. And the Twin Towers are beside Bush, but also next to Osama bin Laden is the bombing of Baghdad. So you get these parallel destructive forces going on. The archetype of that is at the top, which is the atomic bomb, which has hung over the 20th century since the bombing of Hiroshima or Hiroshima. And the point I'm trying to make here is if you look at the two snakes coiled and facing one another, that's the archetypal foundation of the instinctual response. It's a rattlesnake taken from the Live Free or Die New Hampshire symbol, which was actually a positive symbol. It was chosen by Ben Franklin. The rattlesnake only exists in America, and it was seen as a very positive symbol of American strength during the revolutionary times, and there were frequent banners made of it, not as a defensive, recoiling, counterattacking reptile, but as a symbol of America's strength and power. Anyway, I'm using that image somewhat differently because I've got two snakes, two serpents poised to attack one another. I'm saying at the archetypal level, when you attack a group at the level of itself or group spirit, you're going to get this kind of face-off, and then it becomes Christianity on the right with the candles there next to the snakes, and the Muslim religion on the left next to that. So you've got Osama bin Laden and you've got Baghdad, and you've got their assassins poised below. They're going to behead somebody. And you've got Abu Ghraib on the right with our attack dogs. So this is at the level of leadership, it's at the level of instinctual archetype, and then it's at the level of defenses, what I call the defenses of the group spirit. You see the defenses are these assassins, and they can be suicide bombers, or they can be our own soldiers in Abu Ghraib who turn into beasts because of the nature of what they're dealing with. But actually, in some ways, the most important point of this is I'm trying to show the layers of the psyche, and the bottom layer is the Crusaders against the Muslim religion. That's the Crusades. That's the cultural context. In fact, what was Bush's great slip early on in all of this? He basically called it a Crusades. I don't think he meant to, but he called it a Crusades. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that there were a lot of the Christian right who felt that we needed to start an inflammatory process for the apocalypse to occur, which would bring the last judgments and the apocalypse.
Burn the Koran.
Burn the Koran. That's what they're doing. Burn the Koran. It's still very much alive. So, but the cultural context for this current standoff has, at least 1,000-year history. So those are the riverbeds, the old riverbeds. So this, in a sense, you could say this is one way of imagining the situation that Obama was inheriting, which is a paranoid standoff between two cultures in which the archetypal defenses of the two cultures are positioned to attack one another to defend what they see as their threatened group spirit. That's, in a sense, you could say that's an X-ray of the collective psyche. And Obama's basic job as president, I think, was to dismantle the structure of this paranoid standoff between the collective psyches of two civilizations. That's a very grandiose kind of statement and model, but I actually think that was his fundamental, that was his promise to America. And people were disillusioned with the war. The war went very badly for all sorts of reasons, and it was a mess. It has been a mess. And actually, it's just a week or so ago, he announced that that combat was over, which unfortunately sort of just looked a little bit to me like George Bush standing on the aircraft carrier announcing that the war was over. One becomes frightened when politicians, as much as you love them, declare something over when you've still got 50,000 troops in there as support. But if you think of what his task was as president at the level of the collective psyche, it was to dismantle this very powerful image that I think was being broadcast all over the place, and that each of us carried in our collective psyche at some level, whether we accepted it or not. This image is familiar to all of us. We know every aspect of this. We probably know most of the images, and the face-off is pretty clear to us. This would be cultural complexes at a very large level, which is of two civilizations really squaring off against one another. Not that Bush represents all of Western culture and Osama bin Laden represents all of Islamic culture, but in sort of our most shadowy sides, on both sides, this is what was running the show. This was the deal. That's the deal. So, you know, the promise of Obama and Obama's task as president, I think, was to, in some sense, defuse this very toxic intrapsychic and extrapsychic configuration that really did threaten an apocalypse, and probably still does in one form or another, and we still see eruptions of it in the burning of the Koran or whatever. I mean, it's everywhere in the same way that racism can. When Jung talks about the riverbeds, and we keep going back to that, I keep going back to that, Murray would keep going back to that, we really do imagine that these are ongoing parts of the human psyche over the last couple thousand years, and it doesn't take much to stimulate them. Usually it takes some kind of fear or threat, and then the collective as an organism will resort to more primitive defenses. So the question from the woman in France, you know, what about all these cowboys and no taxes and every man for himself? Well, you could see that in this context, that there's fear and threat and a defensive sort of wanting to protect oneself in terms of what one sees to be most valuable about one's tradition. Yes.
Sister, they're really great to be here. Thank you so much. Oil has not been mentioned, nor has water, except in the real sense, the woman who called from India, and the reality of global warming, which is larger than any of these issues. So, do you think that the challenge of that, dealing with that, can ground all of this craziness in action?
Yeah, you've anticipated my next 4 slides.
Oh, sorry.
But thank you. I mean, we're right. Well, we're right on track. The next question is, both domestically and internationally, what are, and I call them cultural complexes because I see them polarizing groups of people what are the cultural complexes that we as a people or as a nation or as Western civilization face, and what's Obama's relationship to them, and is anything positive or constructive happening with them? Can we have the next slide? Let's see what we got here. I call this Homo economicus. And this was right when the everything was collapsing economically, and I went into the Mill Valley liquor store and I looked at the magazine section, and I saw these two images next to one another, and I thought they were actually the same face. One of them on the left is Paulson, who was our Secretary of the Treasury and was trying to save Solomon Brothers or Goldman Sachs while sinking Lehman Brothers because he was loyal to Goldman Sachs and whatever. But he has a very grim face, which somehow looked to me like the Neanderthal man on the right. But Homo economicus is Obama's biggest task right now, because not only is the national economy, but the world economy looks as though it's, I don't know if it's a double dip recession, but things are very, very sluggish. And in the next image, I think that, you know, money is our God. There's no question about it. And what is Obama, or what are we going to do about money? Or Bernard Sartorius talked this morning about our consumerism. Can we have the next image? I don't know if you can see this. I love this image, but it's really a department store as altar. And it's buy. It's what George Bush's response to 9/11. Shop. Well, retail therapy. So we are a consumer society, and as Bernard said, we've consumed as much since 1950 as the whole world up until 1950 did. That's who we are as a people. If I were an Islamic fundamentalist, which I'm not, that's why I would attack the World Trade Center, is that our consumerism is so destructive of the world, and the problem is we're so dependent on it. When the economy collapses and people are out of jobs, the way you stimulate it is to try and get people to be able to consume again. That's what we live on. So, you know, what's Obama going to do about that, or what are we going to do about our consumerism? I mean, this is our, to me, our consumerism is our number one cultural complex. And there's almost nothing that stops that. If you look at money in political campaigns, if you look at the race for the governor of California now, it's all about money and it's all about consumerism. And we're all part of it. It's not just them out there. We're just all part of it. Let's move on to the next one. You raised the question of the environmentalism, and this is our degradation of the environment and our exploitation of the material world is another one of our, it's part of our consumerism, I guess, but I see it as our relationship to the environment and the way that we eat it and consume it is another massive complex of the Western psyche, which threatens to destroy us. What's the next one? Oh, this is by a Latino Mexican American woman, I think, named Garza, and I chose it because it's about community. It's about an extended family, and I thought it was just a wonderful, almost primitive image of primitive painting of community. And Bernard again spoke about splits between the individual and the community. And those who are individuals and cowboys aren't going to be for medical health and coverage for all of us. So our whole relation to the social fabric and our relationship as individuals to the community, I think Obama's passing the medical health care reform was just a major accomplishment. I think winding down from Iraq and getting some health care reform are two absolutely major accomplishments. But our whole relationship to one another as community is under just enormous threat, I think. And I chose this image because it's so suggestive of people, extended families living together and being together, and it's quite different than how a lot of families experience themselves today, as isolated geographically and psychologically and fragmented. What's the next one? Oh, I love this one. This is called Progress, and it was done in 1850. And it's really the American dream of the 19th century, which is the westward movement and expansion, and the floating anima goddess is named Progress. And it's all about our belief in the infinite ability to expand westward. Of course, a few bison and a few Indians get sacrificed along the way, but it's sort of the American dream as westward movement and promised land. And I think our belief in progress as an archetype, if you will, and our addiction to that, in the sense that we can always conquer and solve new problems, is also one of our major problems. We believe so much in the infinite progress of ourselves, because that has been our trajectory as a nation, that it's actually become almost like a right that we think we have, and progress can be distorted. Rumsfeld believed in progress, which was to conduct a smart war with fewer men, and that was progress. But it gets distorted and violated in all sorts of ways.
Should I go next?
Let's stop and let's have some questions and discussion. Yes.
There. This is just a comment. When I was a child, I used to watch Ronald Reagan with Death Valley Days, and I think it was Westinghouse or was it G? And you'd always hear progress is our most important product. And so, interesting that how do I turn it off?
That's a wonderful comment, because it links progress with product. So it's the belief in progress as a consumer creation. So it links those two deep beliefs, that consumerism is good and good for the economy, and progress is unlimited. And I think in 1950 or whenever that was, I was watching Howdy Doody, and it was wonderful stuff. We believed in it, I think.
I think we all did.
Reagan was still a house dealer.
He was selling borax or
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your concept of cultural complex is an extremely important contribution to the whole Jungian theoretical architecture. And it struck me when you were showing the film that one of the things that seems to be going on in that film is demonstrating that cultural complexes can actually evolve, and that we can actually take cultural complexes to a higher level. And you were just talking about, okay, this is Obama's challenge. I was wondering if there's a challenge for us in this space where we're sitting around waiting for Obama to articulate his transcendent insights, which is probably only going to happen episodically. And then he gets into the politics and he tries to fix healthcare and the economy, but we're still waiting for that next transcendent moment from the leader. But what is the role of us as followers in this situation?
I think that nails it. I think it's the most important question in some ways, because I think that the whole idea of relying on leadership, even in a way, the title of this conference about leadership and individuation and the case of Barack Obama, it both states the problem in a way, which is that we do rely too much on our leaders to orchestrate these shifts, when in fact the shifts are, in my opinion, at the level of the collective psyche. If you're going to get a real shift, it has to happen in how these things live inside of each one of us and in the community. That's why I cited the example of gay marriage, because there's a there's an example in which a complex around homophobia, if you will, gay and anti-gay, has undergone such rapid transformation in the collective psyche in such an unbelievably short period of time, historically. And it's kind of amazing, and by and large you could point to Harvey Milk and a few other people, but it's not been a single leader that's led to this shift in the collective psyche. And it's a profound shift. And I don't think Obama is going to cure us of our consumerism. And I think he could help lead the way with regard to our relationship to the environment. But I don't think he's going to cut down our reliance on foreign oil significantly. Although he could direct some more money to alternative energy sources. But basically, it still remains with us as a people to have that shift occur inside. I mean, my wife is still trying to train me about recycling, because I always put the wrong thing in the wrong box, and now there's a new box for different sorts of things. So I agree with you that we can get too passive in relation to our leadership, as if they're going to manipulate the change in the collective psyche, and it's very false. A good leader read the collective psyche, and if he isn't too manipulative, actually try to move it along in a positive direction.
Actually, part of Obama's campaign message was, it's not me, it's you. It's the people that need to be moving. So,
Tom, I've got
it sounded too much like that's... Go ahead.
Well, Tom, I was just going to say I've got an email question I might read at some point. And then just to remind us that we're 7 minutes away, and it's 5 o'clock on a Friday on the East Coast, so we'll have to wrap up relatively on time. Are you okay if I read one email question and then turn it back over to you?
Sure.
Okay. This one is from Colorado, so closer to your end. That's from Sandy. She says, if we can assume that there is a dual process occurring within individuals and within the human species, one that pulses the uniqueness of the individual, and one that pulses the unity of the collective, perhaps the unity of the entire universe, is it possible that the more we have moved towards one, the more the other is stimulated to identify itself until some emergence of the two can take place? Could you suggest what such an explosion of these two forces might look like, or what the experience might be? My own thought goes to the explosion that occurs when the sperm and the egg come together, which tears apart the egg and breaks up the sperm, until the two create one, which is in fact a collective. Well stated. Any comments on that piece from Colorado?
I'm all for conception.
Right. And gay marriage.
And gay marriage. Yes. That's a very interesting, that's a very spacey, mystical, and very interesting comment. And actually, it frightens me, not the sperm and the egg, but the idea of one stimulating the other, because I can imagine that being both enormously creative and as destructive as the atomic bomb. It frightens me when you get such opposites colliding, and it frightens me that they may not come together in a creative way. In fact, I see what happened between the United States and Iran as that kind of us versus them, in which you've got one and the other. They see themselves as one, we see ourselves as one, and that one nation or one civilization. So it's both very exciting comment and makes me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you. Well, leave me a minute or two, but if you want to spend the last 5 minutes talking from that end, we'll wind down just a few more minutes.
Well, one thing I'd just like to repeat, because I hope I've stimulated people enough in terms of image and symbol and culture to want to go to eris.org and look for it. It has not yet been announced, but what really interests me is the relationship between cultural complexes and images, contemporary images that speak to that. And we're hoping this will be a research project that stimulates people from around the world. And that's part of why I use images, not for this project per se, because I think the images, as the last commenter from Colorado, they are very powerful, and they are symbolic in the way that Bernard was sort of saying we've de-symbolized the world, but there are very powerful symbols out there. Did you have a comment, Laura?
Yeah, I have kind of an odd comment and question. So you were saying that the collective psyche is rooted in ancestry and our ancestors, our heritage. And you said that Obama's task is to dismantle the paranoid stance between two peoples or two civilizations, to dismantle the aggressive stance between two peoples. And I'm brought back to the Red Book and Jung's image of the blood. And when he heard that inner voice and it said, "Wake the dead, you must listen to the dead." So I'm kind of ending with this, but I'm just asking you, in a way, it's another way maybe to hold all this. Is there some kind of listening that we have to do in terms of our ancestry that also might help the transcendent function in terms of the cultural complexes?
Steve?
I would just say very well said. Yeah. Well, with that, I do have a wrap up. Do you want to say anything, though, Tom, before I give my closure?
Well, I think that it stimulated such an interesting comment from Laurel, and I'm glad that people had fun. And it is a dance. And the more we can dance around these issues, whether it be wakening the dead or what we do about Homo economicus or what we do about the environment, but the more we can have actually have a conversation about these things. That's what's so upsetting about the modern world. There's almost no dialogue or conversation. So it's not just listening to the ancestors, it's listening to other people.
Well, one thing I would add to that, I mean, Laurel's comments do stimulate me to think towards the next piece. I think what we did today was talk a lot about that polarity of opposites. You've got Western, you've got Muslim, you've got rich, poor, black, white, all these us, them cultural complexes that are in tension. The next question, which is so hard to get to, but yet a lot of the comments talk about, is, well, how do you go beyond that? And the transcendent function, which is jargon in the Jungian term of somehow transcending those opposites, east, west, us, them, into something that's truly new, truly transcendent, truly moving us forward. I think that's the million-dollar question that we're all wanting an answer for, but yet nobody really has a clear answer. We have a fuzzy image for that, but nothing really absolute to it. And I think, Tom, your talk today has really helped us move towards that path, even we don't know fully what that is. It's 5 o'clock on my time. Let me just say a few thank yous. Murray, Bernard, and Tom, I thought you guys did a fabulous job today. Really appreciate all the talks. This is really new ground for us. The Asheville Jung Center, we've been doing bread and butter sorts of talks on the pillars of psychotherapy and the Red Book. This is the first time we've taken a political, social, anthropologic look at the psyche. And we would like people's comments on this. Is this something that works? Is this something that we'd like to continue? Should we have this an occasional series where we go deeper into some of these topics? Or do people feel this is too far from Jungian forwardness? For me, it's been a wonderful day, and I've really enjoyed this piece. You can reach us through AshevilleJungCenter.org, and it's got the DVDs from before, it's got places to comment, the blog that we get, but please do let us know what your thoughts are about this. So, again, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And Tom, you've done a marvelous job today.